more than 1.5 million refugees have fled Ukraine amid a Russian invasion, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. This is the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. It's understood more than 300 civilians have been killed since Russia invaded Ukraine late last month. For more on the story, we're joined now by Laura Padoan, who is the spokesperson for the UN's refugee agency. Laura, good morning to you. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Some incredibly heart-wrenching stories coming from those who have been able to cross from Ukraine into bordering Poland, Hungary, Slovakia. What are some of the stories that you're hearing as well as the UN Refugee Agency?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Yes, as you say, this is now the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. And since the 24th of February, 1.5 million people have fled Ukraine into neighbouring Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Moldova. What we're witnessing now in Ukraine is tremendous human suffering. Sadly, we've witnessed heartbreaking scenes from towns and cities in Ukraine, Mariupol and others, Kharkiv, where people have been unable to escape those cities. We were promised a humanitarian corridor this weekend, and sadly that did not transpire. So what we've been seeing is civilians who have come under attack, utterly heartbreaking stories of people who have been desperately afraid, hiding in subway stations, in underground bunkers, in basements, unable to leave their cities because of the bombing, because of the shelling, and when they have tried to leave, they have come under fire. The UN has reiterated that civilians should not be a target and that civilian infrastructure should not be a target in any conflict.
I mean, one of our own citizens here in South Africa, having made an incredible journey from Ukraine to neighboring countries, finally landing in our country this morning, he tells a story of being pepper sprayed, being targeted, not only because he's not Ukrainian, but also because he's black, having walked past a number of corpses in trying to get through to the border. Are you still hearing these kinds of stories of racism as people try to get to safety from Ukraine?
Well, it's deeply alarming to hear of his experience. We have seen reports of racism and discrimination of people trying to flee Ukraine. There are a large number of foreign students, of migrant workers, also around 7,000 refugees and asylum seekers from other countries who were in Ukraine before the start of the conflict. We take these reports incredibly seriously. We've made clear that there should be no discrimination between people who are trying to flee Ukraine, and that asylum should be made available to everybody regardless of their nationality and race. Our UN High Commissioner Filippo Grandi has personally discussed this issue with authorities at the highest level in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to ensure that people are not experiencing racism. We've been assured that these are not state policies, but we will continue to intervene if these reports do continue to occur, and we will continue to stress that everybody, regardless of their race, should be received in the same manner.
Laura, you spoke to us just a moment ago about those humanitarian corridors, those green zones that were meant to come into play. Ukraine describing it really as an opportunity for Russia to sort of get its forces back on track for the next round of bombardment. They say the green zones never existed. Is that your experience as well? Was there any kind of green zone at all where the elderly, where women and children were able to get to safety?
Well, we do know that people are experiencing extreme difficulty in trying to leave the country. We know that parties are in dialogue about establishing a humanitarian corridor. millions of people are now in need of safe passage and urgent life-saving assistance. In several parts of Ukraine, the humanitarian situation is increasingly dire. Supply chains have been broken so that it's very difficult to get through medical supplies. People are now without water, without food, and without power. Critical infrastructure has been destroyed, and there is a great deal of human suffering. What we need now is assurances that UN and aid agency staff can operate, that we won't be hampered by the security situation, because we are concerned about the safety of our colleagues who are operating in Ukraine. But that also, if there are civilians who do need to flee, that they are able to access safety to leave the country and aren't under attack when they try to leave.
There's been reports this morning, just over the past couple of hours, of a ceasefire in Kyiv, in Kharkov, and in Mariupol. Do you know anything about these reports and whether they are true?
I haven't received any information about a ceasefire. That would be very welcome. We again call on all parties to respect the ceasefire, to make sure that that civilian space is protected. We have been working around the clock to position aid, supplies and relief items inside Ukraine, and we're also setting up reception centres and temporary accommodation for people who are internally displaced in the country. We do need safe access to be able to deliver those relief items. And as I say, it's vital that civilians have access to safe passage should they need to flee.
In terms of the teams from the UN Refugee Agency, are you saying that once you can verify the existence of a ceasefire, those teams are ready to move in and provide much needed aid and relief there?
Well, our teams are on the ground, they're staying and delivering, and their efforts have been hampered by the security situation, but we have been operating since around the clock since the start of the conflict. So we have been able to deliver sleeping mats, tents, blankets to people, and jerry cans and water to people who are in need. If the hostilities cease, then we will be able to scale up our operations, because we have been urgently airlifting supplies to neighbouring countries and ramping up our operations for refugees in neighbouring countries as well.
Laura Padoan, let me thank you for your time this morning. Thanks very much for giving us an update on the work that the UN Refugee Agency is doing in what is now being called the fastest growing crisis in Europe since World War II. 1.5 million